Hi, everybody. Hi, Bev. How are you doing?
Hi, Brian. I'm really well, thank you. Good to be
Uh,
back.
and good to see you again. It's been a couple of weeks since we last did one of these. I've been out and about doing some photography. I know you have as well, so it's quite good.
Yeah,
For
for the
those
bit.
of you, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, it's my sister Bev, who's down in the Midlands of England, and me, Brian. I'm up in the north, the frozen north of England, right on the Scottish border. So I think this is episode 6, if I'm not mistaken, of Take Better Photos course. And we've
That's
got
right.
past all the photography bits and pieces, all the technical side. So we're now doing lots of composition stuff. And I left you with a couple of tasks, if I remember right, last time to do some. We looked at the rule of thirds. How did you get on with that?
Yeah, so you asked me to do some research into the rule of thirds, and I was familiar with the rule of thirds anyway. I kind of knew what it was, but I hadn't really did any kind of research. And what I started to find, so I went to the University of YouTube, as you do, and there's so many mixed messages. So I got the impression that rules are there to learn and then forget. Well, not forget, but but break, I guess. So the rule of thirds is quite obvious, but then when I started to look into it, obviously we got into Fibonacci spirals and very mathematical rules and diagonals and horizontals and rules of like there was other rules about sort of not quite thirds but like quadrants almost, and so I kind of got a little bit confused by it all, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it is a confusing thing, but there's a great quote which I used to quote a lot of the time. One of the British air aces of the Second World War, guy called Douglas Bader, always used to say that rules are for the obedience of fools and the guidance of the wise. And I think photographic rules are certainly that. You know, the rule of thirds is great, but it's very much a fluid sort of rule. It's there to guide you on some of the composition aspects. And I think we're going to come to this a little bit later on when we look at other common rules in photography, to realize that actually the rules aren't there to be adhered to. They're there to give you a little bit of a push in the right direction. So how did you get on with the photographs? Did you get much done?
I
And
got a few.
have you
I
got a
got a
few that we can
few.
see?
Yeah, shall I share?
Yeah, why not?
I did take lots. I've um, kind of edited them down or whittled them down, I should say. Can you see my photograph?
Yeah, I can see the photograph up there now. That looks like some sort of a well, is it?
It is, yeah. It's a very old um I don't know what you'd call it really. It's something in the market square in Oakham in Rutland, and it's like an old well, like an old water pump. So you can see the handle on the right hand side and then the spout coming forward. And I took it from quite a distance, and it was so busy. There was all sorts of things around it. Um, and then I decided that actually what I really liked about it was the age and the patina on the wood and how it was cracked. And as I moved right in towards it, I lost a lot of the busyness around the outsides. So it's not particularly interesting photograph, I guess. But in terms of composition, the one I took before that was quite wide, sort of there was a lot in there, and there was no focus of the photograph. So, there was nothing I was actually focusing on. So I moved in to take that because I just thought it was quite interesting.
Now, well, look, we're talking about basically rules and things on this. There's not a great deal of the sort of two-thirds rule. You've got a very much a symmetrical break vertical down the center, and the spout part is centralized as well. But it's one of the things that I really rather like in photography. You've almost gone to an abstract. You haven't taken the whole thing into view there. You zoomed in on the item itself, and you've become something of an abstract. So you're really looking at a part of it, focusing on a part of it on that. And as you say, the pattern on the wood and the spout are very, very prominent on that. The only thing I would probably have considered, and it's something again we'll come on to in a few moments when I'll show you some examples as well, it's very much a vertically orientated object. So one suggestion may have been to actually orientate the camera sideways and take it as a portrait shot rather than a landscape view shot, because that would emphasize the height rather than the width of it. But apart from that, yeah, it's to me, it's one of the things that I rather like. I like the idea of abstract, And I do like the idea of emphasizing patterns by using that abstract on there. So yeah, good shot.
What I wish I'd done with hindsight is actually, rather than taking it looking down, would be to get down on the ground and take it slightly looking up, so there was less of the path, you know, the paving slabs around it.
Well, hold on to that thought, because again, when I give you some of the examples for other rules, that's a very pertinent point. So hold on to that thought. It's a really good point to make. So well, yeah, great. Let's have a look at the next one.
So this is from Oakham Castle, looking up at the church, and what I was thinking was actually I wanted. I liked the kind of the fact that everything's sort of pushed up towards the left-hand side. But what I don't like, actually looking at this now, is how much pathway, the gravel pathway there is in the foreground. That seems to dominate rather than the church, which is what I wanted the focus to be.
So how would you consider changing that? If you were to redo this photograph now, what would you consider to change that photograph to emphasize what you wanted to see in it rather than what you achieved?
I think I'd have taken quite a few steps towards the church. I'd have been closer, or I'd have zoomed in more.
I was going to say, can you bring up the properties on that while you're talking?
Oh, it's not showing anything.
Don't worry, if that's the case, it's not a worry. I was just curious as to what the actual zoom had been on that lens, because it looks a fairly wide angle view that you've got. So as you say, maybe zoomed in a little bit more. And that would have also had the effect of foreshortening the depth of field, so that you would have, it changes the perception of distance. It compresses more. So that may have helped in that instance. But you would have also then lost some of the leading lines that you've got with that path. So it's a balance, it's a compromise. If you go too zoomed in, you're going to lose that path altogether. And one of the things that the path is doing is actually drawing the eye, the leading lines into the eye onto the church. So yeah, when we talked about the rule of thirds on there, as I said last time, it doesn't have to be exactly a third of the way down or a third of the way up. You're talking about a movement in that direction. So effectively what you've got is the leading lines are taking up to the church, and they're pretty much off to one side. They're going off to the left-hand third, and the church is effectively on the left-hand third there. If you look at your horizon at the top of the trees, that's pretty much towards the top third. And as the path goes around to the right-hand side, that's giving you a natural horizontal line, which is also around about the top of the bottom third, if you like. So you're getting some separation on that. And I think this is quite a good example, because as I say, you don't need to be exactly on the 1/3 marks. It's drawing you into places. And I think you're absolutely right. I think by using a small amount of zoom, you would have still had the leading lines there. But what it would have done, if you'd kept it in the same plane, you would have found that the tree line, the horizon, would have moved up slightly in the shot. And that path would have moved slightly down in the shot because you're more zoomed in, and would have emphasized those even more. And again, the church would have been more prominent. So I think you're right, either a few paces forward or zoom in a little bit. And I think it would have changed the shot. But the important thing is you just analyzed your own photograph and come up with suggestions which are in the right way to move there. So the next time you take this photograph, it's something you'll have in the back of your mind and say, oh, I remember the last one I took like this. So they're really useful, these shots. Let's have a look at the next one. That's a good shot to show. Yeah.
This, I guess, was what I was trying to do, was frame the doorway, reflect the arch of the doorway in the arch of the poppy stand. But it was quite difficult to do that, because the poppy stand was actually at a funny angle to the building. So I took this photograph about 7 or 8 times, taking a step either to the left or the right each time to get different angles. And this was the one that was closest to what I was trying to achieve. But I don't like it, if I'm honest. I put it in here because from a composition point of view, forgetting the rule of thirds, what I was trying to do was get I wanted the eye to be drawn through the archway of the poppies to the arch of the door and get that sort of symmetry. And I didn't get it, but that was the plan.
Well, there's two things on this which immediately come to my mind. And first of all is the fact that, unfortunately, the real world isn't a studio. A studio, you can move things around so they're in perfect position. You can change your lighting so it's perfect. I mean, you've got shadows there, which you could say, well, if you didn't have the shadows, but the world isn't like that. And one of the things of being a photographer in the real world is you have to make the best of what you have. So the fact that you've got a bit of shadow, well, that's okay. It's not really too prominent. I think that's great. The fact that it's off to one side, yeah, it's a bit of an issue, but that's what it is. That's what the actual object is, and you're trying to record the object. One of the things I rather like about this, it's showing one of those rules. Again, we talk about rules, but they're more ideas, if you like, the composition ideas, the directions. I've used the word rules a few times because that's the general term which is used in photography, but it's actually a really, really poor thing because it isn't a rule. It's a directive. It's a
guide.
A guide. And one of the things that this is shown, which doesn't come up very often, but really, really works well on this one. Effectively, what you have is a whole load of concentric circles. You've got the outer circle of the metal framework. You've then got the inner circle of the metal framework. You've then got the outer arch in the concrete, which again has several layers of inner arches, which are all concentric circles around there. Then you've got the door itself. So I think from that, and you've got them fairly well lined up with each other. Again, it's just real world. You can't have it perfect. But do you know what? If it was perfect, it probably would lose some of its impact. So you've got this wonderful idea of concentric circles, and it's almost like a tunnel. And where we talk about lines, converging parallel lines, which draw you into something, the idea of concentric circles also pulls us in as almost as if you're going down a tunnel. And I think it's a great shot. I think you've used the real world to the best of the abilities. I think that it tells a story, and we've said this from the very, very first episode of these. Photography is there to tell a story. The story may be that you're doing professional shoots as an advertising shoot for something. You're still telling a story about how good the product is you want to buy. It could be a birth shot or a child shot, but just telling the story about a youngster's life, because that's what we're doing when we're doing kiddie shots and things for people, portraits or school photos, which show that this is showing something. It's showing a story. And to me, the idea of the story is it's drawing you into that picture, so it becomes more than just a flat image. And those concentric circles gives it a third dimension. So again, great. I know that and like most creative people, when you're doing something, as soon as you create something, you're looking for the excuses almost to stop other people criticizing in the first place. But the fact is that real world actually gives it the charm. And if it was perfectly straight, it would probably be boring. So I think it's a good shot.
Sorry, what I also got from that was the need to consider the time of day. So because of it, this was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hence the shadow of the arch is quite long. And I think if I might go back and try this again at different times of the day, maybe when the sun's at its highest, maybe hopefully shortening that shadow.
Well, again, on this, we'll cover this in a later episode. I don't want to be covering it here, but there's an interesting thing which you just brought up as well, and it is worth bearing in mind. Times of day and the way that the shadows, and times of year, because remember, we're in the first quarter of the year, we're just coming to springtime. In the UK, it's just changed to the different time zones, so we've just changed the clocks by an hour. But the sun is still relatively low in the sky in comparison in the mid-afternoon, 3 p.m. in the afternoon here. You've got some fairly long shadows. But what you do, if you look at those shadows, although they're distinct, they're not really pronounced. They're not really hard. You've got a softness to the edges of the shadows. If you'd gone more towards midday, yes, the shadows may be shorter because they are the sun's more overhead. But what you're going to find is it's a harder light. And we'll talk later about hard and soft lights. And that's basically the definition of the light, how much the shadow, the edge of the shadow is very defined, or if it's very gentle, the change between light and dark. So even if you had gone for the shorter shadows at lunchtime, you probably would have found that they may be more prominent because they are more defined. So there's always these compromises. And again, the real world, it's not the middle of summer, it's not the middle of winter, it's March. Sorry, it would have been March when you took these, possibly at beginning of April. But basically, we're in the end of the third month, beginning the fourth month of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. This is what you're going to get. So again, it's making the best of it, and it's a compromise. All the way through, we've talked about compromises, whether it be the physical side of aperture, speed, and ISO on the physical side of the camera, or if it's a compromise between shadow length versus shadow hardness. So there's always that compromise, and we work around it. Good photograph. The other thing that's worth pointing out as well is, and I don't know if it was part of your thinking on it, but the red poppies on that actually give a little bit of a sparkle, or a little bit of a highlight to what would have been without them. I think a little bit of a dull photo. So again, they give that little bit of an interest as well, and again tell something of a story, because that gives a description as to what the arch is for. In the UK, we use poppies as a remembrance for fallen in wars. So anybody from the UK would instantly recognize that as having a significance on there. And again, that's part of the storytelling. Okay. So good shot. Brilliant. Let's have a look at the next one.
Thank you. Oh, I've gone a bit far. Sorry. Let me just go back one. This was that same church. And there's some, so basically it's the old castle grounds in Oakham. So a lot of this is sort of dilapidated, and this might seem a bit odd, but I rather like this weird fence that seemed at complete odds to the sort of prettiness of the church and the bushes in the background, the trees in the background, and then there was this hideous wooden picket fence. And what I really liked was this sort of the yellow flowers here defiantly standing, trying to add some sort of prettiness to the scene that was destroyed by this awful fence. So whilst it's probably not a very pretty photograph, I quite like that kind of the paradox of the sort of old church and that kind of quintessentially English church in the background with this bloomin' hideous sort of fence.
Yeah, I have a problem when I'm taking things in the middle of towns these days because of street furniture. I'm sick to death of road signs and bollards and all sorts of things on the streets. We have they grow faster than forests of the UK, street signs. And I think this, again, is typifies it. Do you think you succeeded in telling the story in that photograph to somebody who wouldn't necessarily know what you were intending? And if so, what makes that happen? If not, how would you change it?
Oh, gosh. I don't know, because I don't know how I would be able to tell what other people were thinking. I think chances are people would look at it and go, why is somebody taking an awful picture of a fence that's ruined a picture of a nice church?
The only thing I would say, I mean, and this is where some of the thing it comes in, photography is yours. There's an awful lot of critics out there who will tell you you're right or wrong, but at the end of the day, the photograph is yours. And it's how it's going to come across. Me personally, I would struggle on this one insofar as to read the story you're after. So the description that you gave is interesting. My thought maybe would be to zoom in so you've got rid of the steeple. So you've effectively taken it so the fence and the church are totally dominant. So I'd probably have zoomed in quite a considerable amount so that I've got the, excuse me, I've got the, and you've got a vertical, which is great. So you've got the flower, the fence, and the main part of the church in the photo. And that to me may tell the story slightly better. But again, this is subjective. It's how it's perceived by individual people. I'm not totally convinced that even if I'd done that, I could have told the story any better. So it is interesting, but it shows that photography is a very personal thing. I've been putting some videos out of my own photos recently, and my self-confidence is fairly low. I put out a video recently which I really wasn't too pleased about, and I got one of the nicest compliments you can imagine on the comments. So how we perceive things compared to how our audience perceive things is often very, very different. Because what I consider to be a poor video, which I struggle to understand why people would actually watch it, somebody gave me one of the nicest comments I've ever heard on it. So although we shoot photos for other people to get a message across to other people, we've got to be careful that it's not swamped in just trying to satisfy one person or one style of people. So again, interesting photograph. As I said, that one doesn't click onto me for the story. but now they've explained it, it has total sense. So I would understand it from there.
What I think I like in its favour is that I've managed somehow to get the whole height of the church in there. It is on a hill, so I was looking up, which was an advantage. And looking at it, I'm wondering if actually, if I was to crop it, can you see my mouse?
Yeah,
if I was to crop this tree out and everything that side, it would, and as you say, maybe none of these have had any kind of post-production on them. They're exactly as they are. I don't know whether there would be a way of lifting the light here, because it's much lighter here than it is here, whether that would enhance, sort of make the fence stand out a little bit more, so it became a part of the story and not just a kind of
it's a difficult one. It's difficult one, because what's right and what's wrong on it, and that's where we are. But a good shot. And it's interesting though, we talked about the rule of thirds. You can see that the church is very much on the left hand third vertically. The fence line is hang fire a sec, I'll edit this out, we'll come back to it. So just going away from to go out the house. It's interesting because if we've talked about rule of thirds, so if you look at the church on that, it's very much in the vertical left hand third, and if you look on the fence line, that's hitting on your lower third horizontally. So again, it is actually complying with some of those rules that we've said. It's very much a rule of third photograph, that. And I think if the church was more centralized, it would possibly lose some of the story that you suggested. Or if that fence line was too far up, you would probably further up, you'd probably lose some of that as well. So again, it fits into what we've been talking about, rules of thirds. Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the next one. Great.
This is again in the marketplace centre in Oakham, and it's actually quite a big structure. It looks a bit like, you know, the photograph that you showed us of the witch's hat. It's a very similar structure to that, and I zoomed right into here because I like the pattern on the stone, the pattern on the wood, the pattern on the cobbles. I don't know how, I didn't have the skills to know how, I didn't have the skills to know how to not have the background so overexposed without making this incredibly dark. So in terms of the composition of it, I didn't really consider it, if I'm honest. I took lots and lots of photographs at different angles. There was also a couple with their bikes stacked up against the side, and I waited for ages for them to move, but they didn't.
Real world again, real world.
So in the end, I decided not to go for the whole thing and try and just zoom in on the bit that I thought was the most interesting, which was the stocks. And
again, I think from the composition side, my eye was immediately drawn to the stock. So it's obviously worked on that. A couple of things on this. We haven't talked about post-production. We haven't hit on post-production yet. So, you know, that is for a later episode. We're going to be looking at Lightroom and Photoshop and things like that at a later date. Now, a lot could be done with this in post-production. So if I was taking this photograph myself now, I would say that you've blown the whites out in the background. So I would have underexposed it slightly. Now, because you haven't developed the post-production skills to know what's possible, you wouldn't be aware of that. So you've been looking to expose our main subject. I would slightly underexpose this one to get the whites so they're not quite so blown out, because I know I can pull some of the shadows back out again in post-production. But that's, as I say, for later. What we're doing at the moment, we're not doing any post-production. You've exposed for the main subject, which is great. One of the byproducts of that, though, is because it is so blown out in the background, the clutter, because it looks like there's a waste paper bin and things like that, the clutter is to a degree taken away. So it's actually served to an advantage. What you have done is, again, we've gone in for something of an abstract. You haven't shown the whole building. You've zoomed in on one thing. And I think what we've done is actually nicely done it because you've got the vertical line coming down of the center column, which is actually drawing the eye down into the main part. But those stocks are sitting almost beautifully on the intersection between the left-hand third and the horizontal lower third. So it's sitting in that almost perfectly on that that third break, which again is really, really good. I think the fact that you've got the way that it goes to the column behind it actually works really well. So you've got that drawing in. Good photograph. As I say, without using the post-production skills, I don't think you would have done much better. And again, it's real world. There's a couple of cyclists there. There's waste paper bins in the background. You're not going to go over and take away one of the council's waste paper bins to make your shot good. And again, without post-production to be able to replace it with something, you're not going to get around it. So it's actually, I think it's worked in your favor. Good shot. There's an awful lot worse that you could have done on that, and probably not much better.
Thank you. This was a bit of a challenge, actually. So I loved this cottage. I thought it was really typical Leicestershire thatched cottage. You know, it's what I really was disappointed with was the waste bin and the bus. I don't know if it's a bus stop, but this sign here. And ideally, because it's such a quintessential quaint little English cottage, I could have done without the car in there, but couldn't take that out. What I was aiming for, I was actually stood I was stood up on some steps on a railway bridge so that I could get slightly above it, looking down on it, to try and get rid of all of the other stuff that was around it, because this is actually, you can just see here the give way lines. It was right on a crossroads, like a junction. And I took this about 4 different times, and I ended up slightly underexposing it to get the color, because with the bright daylight, it was really.
I lost you slightly then, but from me, the thing which stands out, unfortunately, and again, it's real world, is the red car. And that nicely draws your eyes to that waste paper bin and vertical sign. Again, it's back to the street furniture I said about a few months ago. A couple of little considerations, and again, we haven't touched post-production. In post-production, these cameras are 4:3 aspect ratio. So you've got 4 units across the top, 3 units down the side, and that's the ratio you're on. There is nothing which says that you have to stick with that. If you have a look behind me, you'll probably be able to see there's a photograph of a Vulcan bomber on the wall. That's very much a panoramic shot. It's a lot wider than it is high. So on this one, with post-production, we can trim that bottom part up. We can actually chop the bottom off while leaving the width. It makes slightly more a more postbox sort of aspect ratio, but it would work really well on this. In fact, it would probably emphasize that length of the building. Again, real world, time of day shows you the shadows. And again, this one possibly would have been better towards midday, because those shadows may not have come into the shot because they would have been close to the building on the left. Again, street furniture, but with the likes of Photoshop, we can get rid of that street furniture. There's a couple of things we can do on that. And again, when I come back to doing Lightroom and Photoshop, there's all sorts you can do. One of the beauties is if you take a photograph like this, take the same photograph, but take 2 steps to the left or 2 steps to the right. And the reason is you're going to have a slightly different view, so you can actually superimpose part of the wall over the top of the bin in post-production later on. Too much of a thing for this particular thing, but that's the sort of things which are capable in post-production. So when you're taking photographs, even though you don't do post-production now, if there's a shot which you're not sure of, take it, because you've taken that shot, you've had that opportunity. You might find later on when you build skill sets up that you can revisit some of these shots and say, do you know what? I've learned a technique to be able to make that change. So again, I think I shown you off screen a little while ago, off air, doing some things with Photoshop, how you can do some amazing things, Photoshop and Lightroom. We can easily get rid of that bin and get rid of that sign. The car's harder, but it's possible to do it. Again, coming back at different times, you might find that the car's not there next time you come. So again, this idea of revisiting stuff. The rest of the composition is fine. I think the exposure, yes, it is ever so slightly overexposed, and again, we in post-production can change that. So I would have gone for a more medium sort of exposure on that one, because we can bring it out, we can get more of the detail on the sky. But we're nitpicking for now. We're going well advanced of what we've got on the screen, and what we've got on the screen is probably a really good shot for the circumstances that we had in the ability. So fine.
In
I think I like the
post-production,
angle.
I know we're not talking post-production, but are we better off underexposing and then bringing it up, or can you overexpose and take it down in post-production?
You can do both, but there are various thoughts on it. Some people say exposed to the right. If you have a histogram, which we'll not talk about too much on the, be exposed to the right means exposed towards the overexposing. And what you're trying to do is get it so that it's just not blowing the whites out, because you can recover stuff from the shadows. You can't recover whites easily. You can't get the detail if it's overexposed. You can't get the detail back again. Those bins you'll never get back in post-production. My personal thing is to try and expose to the middle. I tend to like to try and get my main subject right, but again, it depends what I'm trying to do. If I've got something which has got a really dramatic sky, overexposing is going to get rid of all that detail. So I would tend to do a very average exposure, or maybe even underexposed, to be able to get that, and then bring it up the other way. So some of it comes into what you're expecting to get afterwards by looking at the whole shot. Now on there's clouds in the sky. There's some really nice streak clouds in the sky. I think if you would bring the exposure back down again slightly, those clouds would really become a little bit more dominant, a little bit more impressive. But what you're going to get with that is you're going to also boost up those shadows on the road, which would become more imposing themselves. Again, it's this compromise. Photography is all about compromise and making the best job of what you got. I would say that photo is probably the best you were going to get from there. Fine, let's move on.
It's not an ask the family, do you know what it is? That if anybody's really old like I am, you'll remember Ask the Family. That is looking up the railway bridge steps at Oakham Station. And I took it at lots of different angles that weren't very good. And I took that one, and I don't know why, I kind of liked it. It was a bit of a funny angle that leaves you, it left me when I was looking, even though I'd taken it, thinking, oh, right, where was I on the bridge? I can't remember which bit of the bridge I was on. And then I had to think about it. So in terms of storytelling, for me, it was a little bit ask the family, can you tell what it is?
Well, I've just released a video about Brampton Junction Station and the old Dandy line, which is the line which ran between Brampton Town and Brampton Station. And there's a lovely wrought iron bridge at that station, which I've taken photographs of. And again, I love shots like this. These really appeal to me because it's, from a composition point, you're not looking at anything in particular. You're looking at form, you're looking at shape, you're looking at interaction. There's a lot of interaction in those shapes. You've got the vertical lines, which are giving you parallel, slightly convergent parallels, but you've also got parallel lines at 45 degrees to the left, which intersect that. You've got the red rails which go up and intersect. And to me, it is a bit, it's messy, but the mess in this case is what actually makes it right. If it was more regular, it probably would lose some of its impact. Again, some people will look at this and just detest it. This is one of the best shots I've seen from you, but it breaks almost all the rules. What rules there? You know, and this is typical of it. I love the fact that I love the idea of decay. When you see decay in photographs, you know, if you get something which is beautifully pristine, that's all very well and good. But what you've got is you've got green moss building up and a little bit of rust on that red at the bottom. You've got the paint chipping off on the verticals. So these are really, really good as far as I'm concerned.
Good. I thought you'd hate that one. I thought you were going to go, what is that?
No, that sort of appeals to me, really does appeal to me on that.
So in terms of composition, I'm not sure I did anything with the composition here, but what I was trying to get back to was depth of field, and to try and get that kind of focus. I wanted the detail, and I was focused actually not on the flowers, I was focused on the middle leaf. and that's what I wanted. I wanted to, the grain in the leaf was so prominent. I wanted to get that and have everything in the background blurred. So it, in terms of composition, I don't know how it works. I don't know what it's doing.
Well, let's break it down. Let's have a little look at what we have got there. First of all, you've got two flowers. One's in front of the leaf and the other one's effectively behind it. So to be perfectly honest, unless you wanted to zoom in on one flower, focus on the leaf is the only place you can focus. In reality, it's the center point of the two. It certainly has brought the veins out in the leaf, but I don't think that the leaf is particularly prominent because you've got such a color splash either side of it that it does draw the eye away. So if you were going just for the leaf, I think you failed. You've certainly got it nice and sharp. But what has been the effect of that? You must have shot this probably wide open between f3.5 and f5.6 because that's what your limitation in your lens is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing it was reasonably zoomed in, so it'll probably be about f4, f5, somewhere around about there. At the maximum that the lens would do it because it's variable as you zoom. But let's see what we have got. We've managed to get a reasonably creamy background in it, as good as you're going to get on that lens. Great, you've achieved that depth of field thing on there. You've broadened the detail out, not only in the leaf, but the flowers. I think if you actually had much less of a depth of field on that, you would have found that the back of the top flower and the front of the lower flower would have been out of focus. So I think it's actually served reasonably well for you in that. And if that had been the case, you would have had to focus really on to chosen which one you were going to do. If we look at the flowers, I know what you're saying, but effectively it may be a fluke, but I don't believe in flukes when it comes to rules in photography. I tend to think that we have an inbuilt sense of what's right and what's wrong. And the fact is we just haven't necessarily thought about it. That left-hand flower, the upper flower, is on the 1/3 quadrant vertically. And if you look at the leaf and the lower flower, they are on the horizontal 1/3 quadrant, the lower quadrant on that. And if you look, it's also the flower and the vertical leaves above that flower and the one that comes over the top are pretty much on the right-hand vertical quadrant. It's all rule of thirds, that one. It's almost a box shape if you look at those. But the only thing that's missing is the top horizontal quadrant. And that leaf coming across is almost doing that. It's a little bit high for it, but it's almost there. So I think by fluke or by unconscious following rules, you've hit beautifully the rule of 1/3. And this is why the rule of thirds works, because it is a natural thing. It appeals to us as human beings. It fits nicely into our natural rhythm of things. That's why rule of thirds works, because it hits us well, but also it means that we will naturally try and do something which is appealing. Great shot. I think the colors have come out beautifully. I think the lighting on it, again, if it's fluke, it's great. You've got that wonderful light. The light's obviously coming from the left-hand side. You can see that extreme left-hand upper leaf is quite white almost in that. But I think the lighting is nice and even. There's almost no shadow, so it's a really nice soft lighting. It's brought out a lot of highlights on the flower leaves, on the flower petals, I should say, which given a wonderful change between the almost deep pinks, the almost shocking pinks in the center, to the almost whitish pink on the petals. I think it's superb. The greens are dominant, but without being overbearing. Great. Only thing on this, if you could have got it more creamy, you've got a little bit of mess in the background where there's a junction box or something on that. But to tell you the truth, again, it's real world, and those picked in those flowers draw the eye away from it without being a problem. By the time I'd realized that junction box was there, it was too late. I'd already seen the flowers.
I think that the problem with that was that actually they're growing up against the wall, so they're only actually about 1.5 feet away from the wall. So that it's actually it's an external power socket, and the drain pipe. They're very close. It was really hard to try and sort of blur them out.
It's real world, and I think you've managed on that. So I'd say that's a good shot. When it first came up, my immediate reaction was, I like that. So, if that's what you wanted it.
Again, this was trying to get that depth of field. What I hadn't realized when I was taking it was you can tell it's a hanging basket because of the chains, but I didn't mean the chains to be in it. So again, do you know what? I don't think I'm thinking about the sort of composition and the rules when I'm taking them. It's a bit like, to go back to your driving analogy, I'm busy focusing on the road at the minute and not listening to the engine.
Well, that's it. One of the things that I'm really wanting out of this series of doing this, you know, obviously the idea was to try and give some guidance to you getting into it, because this was the whole point of it. But we decided that we're going to record these more for the fact that what's being passed on information to you, I'm hoping is going to be useful for other people on that. And just on that subject, if anybody is watching these and enjoying it, don't forget to leave a comment below, because we'd love to hear your comments on these. Because they're constructive. And also don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of these videos, and give us a thumbs up because it makes us feel good. On this one, this didn't affect me in the same way as the previous one did. My immediate reaction was, okay. And just for one of the reasons you've said, those chains are totally meaningless for me. They're prominent in the shot, but they're meaningless. That, you know, is it a hanging basket? Is it a part of a gate? Is it part, whatever it is? But also the focus on this, you've done the depth of field, but you've actually got too shallow a depth of field for me. We've got that the left-hand side flower has got a wonderful definition on its petals against the blurry background. But if you look at the right-hand side one, even though it's not a great deal difference in distance, it's out of focus.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can go too shallow a depth of field. There are people who say, well, ultimate depth of field, super fast lenses. But if you don't use it appropriately, it can actually work against you. I think this is one of those ones, it's lost some of the impact that the flowers would have. Your eye is confused. It's, well, okay, that's in focus. That one's out of focus. What is, it's a flower. Yes, I know it's a flower, but it doesn't have any, it isn't crisp. It isn't there. And what are those chains? And, you know, so although you've gone for the depth of field, I would have, to change this, the chains are definitely a difficult one, but I would actually open I would have closed the aperture down slightly, gone for a slightly higher number, just to get that extra bit of depth of field. So instead of being an inch or two wide, it goes to 4 or 5 inches wide, because the creaminess in the background isn't going to change that much, but you would have got your flowers in focus.
Yeah.
This is particularly prominent if you're taking photographs of people, especially if you're using something like a full frame camera, which tends to have a much more shallow depth of field at open apertures. You can get to the point where you get the eyes in focus, but the tip of the nose and the earlobes are out of focus, which makes the whole shot look odd. So people tend to get too much on that. I did a whole session doing a set of school photos one day, and I thought it was being really clever. I changed my camera, I'd gone for a better camera, a better lens, and by the time I finished, I was lucky to get the shots. I got through the skin of my teeth, because you suddenly found that the back of the head was just on that edge of, well, these aren't usable. And it was a lesson. It was a lesson learned. Unfortunately, when you're taking 400 photographs that day, 400 people, it's an expensive lesson to get wrong. So yeah, compared to the previous one.
Let's keep flicking through, because I'm conscious I'm taking up quite a bit of time with these. I don't want to show you that, but I do want to show you that, because I actually love this photograph. The contrast of colors, the crispness of the petals, I really love it. It goes against the grain because it's smack bang in the center, but I feel if it was off center, it wouldn't feel right.
Well, I don't know about that, because the focal point on there, to me, you've got the flower, but you've also got that yellow center, and that yellow center isn't on that yellow center of the flower isn't on the center of the shot. It's slightly off to the slightly low and slightly left, not to the 1/3 point, but it certainly isn't centered. But again, it comes in the flower. You've got a nice shallow depth of field, but the flower itself is crisp. You've got that wonderful use of even light, beautifully even light. I'm in two minds about the other flower. Does that work to add to the photo? I think it possibly does, because it would be a little bit too centered on it. But you could say it draws the eye away. I like this version. I think I would think I'd rather have this than get rid of the other one. But I think that the lighting on that flower, the way that the flower is set, is fine. And if you're taking it too much off to one side, the hit onto the thirds, I think it would have been again a bit too much. I've got no problems with that one at all.
I kind of liked him. Why did I take this? I couldn't get any closer to get away from the barbed wire, but I didn't want the barbed wire to be in focus. I wanted the cow to be in focus. So I focused on the cow's nose, the black and white cow's nose, actually, the middle cow. And what I liked about it was the line of the cows lying down, that sort of diagonal line as they moved away. The eyes sort of focused on the big cow and then were sort of drawn away. So I quite liked it.
Unfortunately, I think on this one, this is one of those ones that's real world again. I think you're going to hide into nothing. And the reason I'm saying that is to do this shot properly, I would have probably wanted that barbed wire more out of focus, a shallower depth of field. But we can already see, you said you focused on the black and white cow in the center, which is great. But if you look at the face of the white cow, it's already good out of focus itself slightly. And I think this is where you have something of a problem on there. So although the shot was appealing to you, I think you're probably onto something which you couldn't fix necessarily in a shot like that. But it's interesting. I can see the concept, but I don't know about you, but I don't think it's worked because of the complications in the real world. So, but the thing is, does it appeal to you? And this is it. If it appeals to you, it brings a memory and it tells a story, then it's a good photograph.
It does, but I'm aiming to try and make the photograph better. So I totally take that on board. What can I say? I just thought they were cute. It looked like a two-headed cow.
Yes, I know what you mean. I possibly would have moved 6 inches to my right, and I probably would have zoomed in a little bit and filled the frame more with the cow, because you would have still had the two-headed cow aspect.
I was as zoomed in as my camera would let me get.
Right.
And
Move
I
6
couldn't
inches
get any
to the
closer.
right, and post-production would have probably taken you we could have digitally zoomed in.
Some of the limitations I had was that I was in a hedgerow. I found a little tiny gap in a hedgerow. I don't think I could have moved any further to the right without falling down. And I couldn't get any closer. So I had real limitations on just getting access to them. So
well, this is what we may come back to, actually, when we come to doing post-production, because there's a lot we could do in post-production to take that into more the field that you wanted to on that shot. So keep that one in mind for post-production.
I was able to move to a different part of the hedgerow to get him. What I was trying to achieve with this was getting her, I guess she is, isn't she? She's not a him. Get her in and also get the full height of the tree. Because so the fence line was my halfway. So I was thinking about the rule of thirds, but I don't know if I've got it right. So the fence line was like the middle third, the cow was the bottom third, and the whole of the tree was the top third. Yeah, there you go.
Good. Let's keep going.
This was me trying to catch my dogs. They look like they're really vicious, but they were playing. So I had the shutter speed quite fast, but I still managed to, they were going so quickly, they were still blurry. And it was really, I just was taking lots of shots. So they weren't really composed. I just wanted to try and get some movement.
The only thing I'd say is on the one previously, it was quite overexposed. So you had some variants that you could do insofar as open the shutter speed again a bit further. That would have darkened it down, but would have given you some of that speed.
Okay. And then that, oh, hang on a minute. I didn't mean to go through twice. These were on the same day, so I don't know. They look like they were on a completely different day. Now this might seem like it's probably not a nice photograph at all, but this is so typical of our two dogs when they play, and they love each other to bits. But I just love the expression on his face, and I was quite chuffed that I'd managed to get them somewhere in the middle of the frame because they were so quick.
Again, keep this one in mind for post-production. There's a few things I would suggest on this one which would really change the shot for you. So yeah, it's good.
and again, way overexposed. And that was all of them. So I'm not too worried about going into that. I guess I must have just changed the kept the shutter speed the same, but the exposure compensation was
Yeah, and
completely
again,
wrong.
as you get light from different directions, this is where, as a photographer, you need to be aware of, of what's going on. Just the change of a light direction as the dogs move to a different part of the garden, you've got light coming from a different way. And because, again, as I've said in the past, the camera is fairly stupid. It takes what it sees and tries to make an average.
So whilst it's not a great photograph and it's quite kind of, the exposure's horrible, what I did love about it was that his back legs are actually off the ground and they were moving so quickly. He was about to do a flip, and he did do a sort of full flip, but it almost looks like he's superimposed on the background, which I just thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. It's fascinating when you catch that, you're catching that moment in time, the freezing that moment in time. But it does just show how critical the shutter speed can be when you got moving subjects. And again, as we've said in the past, it's a difficult thing to do, and this is where the skill comes in. And it's not a given thing. You have to work at it. This is why we go through these things. We've got the beauty, though, as I said a few times, that we can, with a digital camera, we can take lots of shots. And so long as we take the time to analyze what's happened and try to work out, well, why has that happened? Why did that not work the way that I thought it was going to when I looked at it? Or, if only I'd seen that they were in the shot or something. But this is what makes the difference between a good and a bad photographer. And this is what comes with any skill. You have to work at it. So how are we doing on the photographs? Are we?
That's it. That's them all. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Well, they've been interesting. They really have. I'm going to move my screen off to one side. I think what we've learned is that there's lots of different ways to interpret the rules and the variations on that. And I think one of the things that I would say, compared to when we first started around about Christmas time, we've come a long way. Just in using the camera out there, just going out and doing the walks with the camera and using it rather than just having it on the shelf, opens up so much knowledge very, very quickly, which becomes second nature. You mentioned before about my analogy with driving. When you've been driving a little while, you don't look at the gear stick before you change. For our American cousins, we use stick shifts over here. So I know there's a few people in the States watching these videos. We use a stick shift. You have to manually change every time you change gear. But at first you look down towards that stick. After a while, it becomes second nature. You don't worry about where the indicator stalk is or the wiper stalk. When it starts raining, you just switch the wipers on. But that doesn't happen at first. And that's where practice and interpretation of what you're doing comes in, like any skill. I'm going to take you through a few example shots, if I may, as well, Bev, because we've hit on the rule of thirds last week. We've seen a few examples and we've gone through it here, but there was a few things that we came out on those shots there, which I'd like to take you through and make some suggestions as to where we go for the next stage. Okay. Because, as we said, rules are there to be broken, basically. So I'm going to share my screen on here, if I can get it up. They're not necessarily the best photographs. Hopefully you should be able to see that now. Can you?
Yes.
Wonderful. So they're not necessarily the best photographs on there, but they don't have to be. And what we have there, I'm using these to show some examples. One of the rules I really use a lot are converging parallels. Now, as you have parallel lines, as you get further away, those parallels will come closer together. And that can act as a natural draw for the eye. The eye was drawn from the wide to the narrow. So on something like that, that's a war memorial cenotaph where I live in Carlisle. And we've got that natural pathway up to it. We've seen on a couple of your photographs, but also we've got the wonderful thing we've said about white lines being a pain and street furniture, but that vertical post and the white lines for the cycle path actually add to this. They add the drawing it in because it gives you a natural thing into the center part of the shot. So again, from there, great. It's also nicely framed. We'll have a look at framing as well, and you can see that you've got trees out of the side. They act as a natural frame. They're not dominant, but they're certainly framing the actual memorial. So that's a good use of converging parallels and framing on that. If I go to the next shot, This, if you have got any Americans watching it, this is a fascinating place. This is at Omaha Beach in Normandy, and it's the American graveyard for those fallen at on the D-Day landing. It's an amazing place. And what I was trying to do on this was to show some emphasis insofar as the huge nature of the number of crosses, the number of fallen on that. But I wanted in a way which would actually show something relevant. And the problem is when you got something like this, there's so many crosses that it could just become a total mess. So by using the lines, that vertical line of crosses, by trying to get them lined up, and again, we have converging parallels. We've got the center line from the ones with the flags, which has taken us through a line of crosses. But if you look at the next line of crosses, we've got converging parallels taking us into the distance. We look towards the right slightly and the left, and again, you've got channels of converging parallels from there. And the slight lift in elevation as well, you're looking ever so slightly down under them. Now, it's a natural position if you're taking photographs from the eye, but in this instance, what it's doing is it's giving just a nice angle to actually emphasize the number of crosses on that, and a very, very poignant place. And one of the messages, one of the stories I was trying to get across in this was just the unbelievable number of people who lost their lives in this particular battle. And it's just one battle. Fascinating thing on that. And we're using a few of the rules on there, but it also makes an aesthetically pleasing photograph. And again, with the white, we're using contrast on this because the white of the crosses against the green background gives a really nice contrast on that. And it's a regular contrast across. We're not too worried about the fact it's actually not quite level. It's not quite horizontal. So to be perfectly honest, I would, if I was going back to this, I would have leveled it off slightly. But
by that, do you mean, is that where the crosses meet the horizon?
Yeah, the horizon on that
slightly at an angle.
Slightly up the right, which again, it's always worth getting a third party to critique what you do. Never be afraid on your photographs to get somebody else to actually be critical of them, so long as it's constructive criticism, because often you're so embroiled in that main subject. And on this, that's what I was. And it's only looking with hindsight, you think, that should have been more leveled. Hey-ho. But now that I know, I could always go back and redo that. Again, in a similar vein, though, that's a horizontal shot, and it works really, really well. Here's another shot. Now, this, if it was horizontal, I think would lose some of the impact. But what we have is, again, the same graveyard. Interesting with the crosses, we've got, again, the converging parallels. We've got the center line very, very straight for all the way up the center of that. But we have a Star of David, so it's a different religious faith on that one being depicted, which again in itself tells a story. And somebody, not me, I just took the opportunity on this, but somebody has left a rose on that. And again, that gives a rather poignant edge to the story. But again, that idea of the enormity of the numbers of those crosses, the contrast and the converging parallels all tell a story in themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love the way the top point of the star leads your eye up. It kind of points you in the direction of the line of crosses behind. And
again, on this one, with the height of it, if I'd lifted the camera any higher, you would have lost some of that. If I'd put it down any lower, you would have lost some of it as well. So I think that, and again, we said about this, it was a fluke. This was very much a fluke insofar as me getting that angle right. I didn't necessarily think about the time. In fact, if you really want to know what I was thinking about, I was overwhelmed by the grandiose of the place I was in, and it's again it was very, very moving for me. So the photography actually was the second thing I was thinking about, but we naturally come to those sort of situations in our mind. So we're very, very lucky. And again, that subconsciousness really works. Now, again, we've said about leading lines, but this is a slightly different one. This is a place called Blackpool, the northwest of England, a beach area. And we've got this wonderful fence, which is leading us off in the background. It doesn't point to anything. But again, we've actually got converging parallels. Although the parallels are curves, we've got that curve drawing us in. And curved lines really do work well. Sometimes the last ones work well because they were very straight parallels. This one draws the eye off to one side, and it works really, really well. I haven't done anything in the way of post-production on this one. This is literally straight at the camera. So you've got down there, you've got some rubbish, which I would have taken out in post-production. I would have changed the exposure slightly. It is rather messy at the top, but the lines actually draw you away from that. But the reason I put this in is because that works because it's horizontal. To me, that's a totally different photograph. It's the same piece of fence. It's not a great deal different than an angle, but by going portrait, by having the shallower depth of field and changing the aspect of what you can see around it, has totally changed our photograph. So I was stood in exactly the same place, but that little change of portrait, height, and depth of field has changed that photograph totally. So when you get, the point I'm making on this is when you get into a situation, don't be stuck on it. You might be planted on the ground in one place, and you might see something in your eyes in one frame, but that doesn't mean to say it's the only shot there. So without really moving anything apart from a little bit of vertical distance and playing around the camera and swapping around, I've got two totally different shots. So be a bit imaginative, a bit of imagination, be a bit creative in what you do. Moving on from that, again, we're back to Normandy Beach. And again, this is something I found fascinating. Again, this was Omaha Beach. So again, for the Americans, very much a thing of remembrance. We've said about the poppies earlier on one of yours. We've got poppies there. But we've got a couple of American soldiers being depicted, one actually dragging a fallen comrade off the beach on that. And that itself tells a story. But what I found was when I zoomed in onto that, the look of the face told a totally different story. It was telling the same story insofar as dragging somebody off the beach, but that's been sculpted in such a way that there's an emotion in there which you couldn't necessarily see in the previous shot. So putting the two together tells a moving story.
Would you have, with hindsight, would you have potentially changed the focal length to blur out the fence at the back? I find that a bit distracting.
It is a bit distracting, but I don't think I probably would have. What I would have done is I would have elevated myself further up, so I'm looking more down and shown more of the colleague, which would have raised the fence out the way slightly. So I would have still had the main focus on the face of that person, but you've missed a colleague on that one, so you don't know if he's just dragging a bag of equipment behind him, or if he's dragging a colleague. So with hindsight, I would have done it slightly differently. Maybe change the depth of field, yes, but again, this was one of those things in the field. You just take what's there, and I think the white fence would have still been prominent anyway because it was very, very close behind. My favorite one is the one before it, of course, because that does tell the story an awful lot better. And again, with that, you don't notice the white fence particularly, because the eye is drawn to that story. Again, this is one which I brought in, not a terrific photograph. Why have I put this one in? Because we have a couple of trees there. They're wonderful, they're nice trees. It's a nice field, it's a nice sunny day, but it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't tell a story at all particularly. So what I'm shown on this one is that because you've got no break between the two, you don't have a natural sort of break point between the trees and the background, so you have pretty much a non-event. If you can use silhouette against a background, we've got two trees and a nice bit of sunshine today, but what is there is the trees are now, instead of being against a green background, we've got a contrast, we've got a separation. We've used silhouette against the sky to really bring those two out. So where we got that, we have a photograph of two trees in a field. There we have a photograph of two trees in a field.
Yeah, that's very two-dimensional, isn't it? The next one feels much more three-dimensional.
Incredibly so. And again, this is some of the things that you can do. Changing a position, you're also looking slightly up at that one. So again, we've got a rule of thirds in there. The trees are just about in the thirds vertically. You've got a split near enough on the lower third to the center for the land against the sky. But what you really have is that dramatization of the looking up the trees to take on a power, but also you've got separation between the trees and the background, which you didn't have in the previous one. The previous one is, to me, is a non-photograph. It's boring. There's nothing there. But that, again, is just two trees in a field, but it has a totally different dimension. As you say, a three-dimensional look.
I love that you've got the little bit of arch in the tree with the cloud behind it. I really like that.
Again, something of a fluke because you can't necessarily do nature, but also sometimes waiting 5 minutes and looking at the same thing instead of just taking a shot and wandering off, or taking a few shots and looking back and think, oh, that looks good. I managed to capture that one. Never just take a shot and walk away. There's always something else there.
I guess that given a minute or two more and the light might have changed and you might have lost that.
Absolutely.
Color.
This is what they call the golden hour. There's a couple of golden hours during the day. It's sunrise and sunset where you get that real warmth. You get that orangey light rather than the cold blue light. This is very much an orangey light which comes through. And this was the height of summer. I think this was taken at about 9:30 in the evening. And but also, if you were to find the shadows, if you go over the other side of that hill, you would have found those shadows are probably hundreds of yards long because of the fact that it was so low in the sky. But it gives that really gorgeous warmth to the leaves. And again, it's using what you've got natural around the use of the light. If I'd taken that at midday, it would have been a totally different shot. So, yeah. On to this one. And again, these are examples. I'm not saying they're good photographs or bad ones, but what I'm trying to show is how you can have the effects just by having to think. This is a very small church. I love taking photographs of churches. I find that the surfaces of old buildings are wonderful, and there's character in them. But it's a small church in a small churchyard not far away from me. How do you make a small church be impressive? Well, one of the things you can do, it's a fairly wide angle lens, so you're getting some distortion on that. And I've said in previous videos, I actually quite like distortion if it's used in the right place. Now, distortion, to me, if I'm talking about distortion, that can sound a little bit of an odd thing, but what it is, that church is actually rectangular, but in actual fact, there's almost a curvature on the sides because I've used a very wide angle lens. I'm actually very close to the church as well because I'm so wide angle. So to get it so that the church is dominant, I'm very close in, but that creates a distortion. Purists don't like that. Artistically, it's one of my key styles. I do that an awful lot because it appeals to me. But what I've also done to try and get that church to a little bit of power, to a little bit of an impressive shot, I brought the camera really low. So by altering the angle of the camera, that also increases distortion, by the way, if you're not horizontal onto it. But by bringing that camera angle down and looking up, like we did with the last set with the trees, you've suddenly given it a power, you've given it a dominance. And if you look down on something, again, like people, if you look up to someone, you see somebody with an authority, they appear big and they appear powerful. If you look down on people, they become small and insignificant. And that's how we perceive people. We do the same thing with a building. So looking up that building is very much putting it into a position of dominance and power. Final shot.
Oh, I was just going to say, actually, going back to the sort of looking up, looking down, I don't know if there's if this is just me being, this is just the way I'm thinking, but when I look up at something, so I feel very much like I'm in that graveyard in the church. I feel associated with that picture. Sometimes I think when you look down on something, it's almost like looking at it on a stage. So you're disassociated from the picture.
Yeah, you become very remote and things, and it's almost flying over the top of something which you just happen to be there. It is, and you almost feel down amongst the gravestones and amongst the grass on that. Absolutely. My final one is this one, and there's a couple of things on this that I've put this in for. First of all, it's just a street portrait, a guy who was playing a clarinet in Carlisle. What it's done, though, we've managed to isolate by using a little bit of shallow depth of field, but it was one of those things that we couldn't really do much about at the time. This was literally grab the camera and shoot. I didn't think about it, but it just seemed interesting. The fact that he had a white jacket on, it gives us something of a contrast behind. I did like the fact there's a concentration on his face, but if you look at it, it's very grainy. And one of the things that was said in the past was about using a low ISO, about noise. I said that I just grabbed the camera because it looked a good shot. This was on ISO, I think it was 12,800. Somebody been playing around with the camera, possibly me, and hadn't put it back to something in this thing. So this was an incredibly high ISO. And when I looked at it at first, it was actually unbelievably grainy. So this has had a lot in post-production, but it just shows what you can pull back. But also some people will panic about the idea of ISO. How, you know, I've got to be down in the middle, in the low ISOs. I've got to be down. I can't have noise. That's actually a good photograph in itself. It's not bad. It tells a story. And in actual fact, you don't necessarily notice the noise at first because the subject matter works. And I think we can get hung up on ISO, especially in the early days when we don't understand what's going on. Yes, from a noise point of view, it's never going to win a competition. It's never going to be printable in the magazine. But what it does is it's told the story perfectly well there. And again, I think some of the composition rules that we have been nicely filled. The contrast, the leading lines, the clarinet and his jacket actually lead onto the face, and the face is full of concentration. There's somebody who's playing an instrument, you know. So I put that as an example as to how you can actually pull a really bad shot back to something usable. And don't get hung up over the technicalities. Don't get hung up too much about things like noise. Yes, we need to be aware of them, but sometimes the shot is more important. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't know if they've been useful for you on that one. I'm just going to really unshare my screen and come back to you on this. It's been interesting for me because, and again, for anybody who's watching on this, I haven't seen your photographs in advance, so I'm very much criticizing or critiquing the photographs on the fly. And I think that's an important thing to do as well, because first impressions are so important when it comes to photography. I don't know about how you're feeling about your photography, but I see a big difference just in a couple of months we've been doing it. How do you feel?
I feel like, you know, when you start something, you think I'm learning, and then the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So I know I'm learning because I'm starting to learn that there's lots that I don't know, if that even makes sense. It's like whenever you start doing something that it's like playing an instrument. You can learn to play an instrument very quickly in most cases, i.e. you can get a tune out of an instrument quite quickly. But it's not until you start getting the tune out of it that you realise how steep your learning curve is going to be to get good at it.
Well, you can see there's keyboards behind me. I mean, I've been a musician for many years as well as a photographer, and I'm still learning. I'm still at that point. I've been teaching myself some techniques on the keyboards, which I haven't been down before. And I feel like the total novice because some of the left-hand techniques, my right hand's very dominant. My left-hand techniques are so weak at the moment, it's untrue. But I then think about what I was like 2 months ago and think, ooh, I couldn't even think about doing that now. And it's so natural. Again,
I think I need to look back. I need to look back at some of the photographs that I took at Christmas before we'd even started, when I literally just went out with everything on automatic. So I think what I've learned is I may not have cracked it, but I'm starting to understand what I'm aiming for. Yeah. So even if I might not be succeeding, at least I'm not just flicking the shutter and hoping. There is an element of thought going into it. So the biggest thing for me is I'm still really enjoying it. I'm thinking now it's 20 to 7 at night in early April, and the sun is just starting to go down, and I'm thinking actually when we're finished I want to go out and just do a bit of, take a few snaps with the light going down, because I've not done anything at this sort of time of night before.
Well, I think that's an important thing, because the enjoyment of what you do is paramount. I don't play I play musical instruments for money. I make an earnings out of playing musical instruments, but I wouldn't do it to the degree that I do if I didn't enjoy it. But photography, I've run as a business in the past, and the only reason it's not running the business at the moment has been the lockdown of COVID, because obviously I couldn't do what I was doing. But what I've done is I've got into doing the photography for my pleasure again, so much so that I've just bought a new camera, which I was saying before. I still have that fascination I'm almost 60 years old, and I still have the fascination I had when I was 8, 9, 10 taking photographs. I remember fondly when I was an early teenager being on a beach in Northumberland taking photographs of a celebrity shooting, doing a TV shoot there, and the fascination I had when I got those pictures back. That's still with me. And I think that's the beauty of photography. If you can keep that passion, it doesn't matter if they're good photographs for anyone else. It matters if it still gives that drive and that burn in your heart to go out and do it. And if you have that drive that you say, the weather's nice, the lights are looking good, let's go outside and let's capture something on that. And then the pleasure when you bring it back and you see it on the screen. Photography's changed over the years. When I started photography, you had to send the film off and have it processed, and you got the prints back, and there was a real fascination for that, or a disappointment when they didn't come back well. Now that's faster. We can get that dopamine shot or whatever it is. You know, one of the, you know, when you get these sort of shots of the adrenaline of seeing something really good, we can have that faster. But it's still just as big a shot when you can get something on your screen and think, you know, I took that. And I'm pleased with that, and I like the colors, or I like the thing. And if somebody else comes along and likes it too, doubly good. But in actual fact, it's if you get that buzz out of it, and you know, it seems that you are, which is the main thing.
My levels of observation are going up as well. I'm noticing things more that I think, oh, that I quite like the angles there are, the colors are interesting there, and you know, things like my husband is the gardener. He keeps the garden really lovely. I like to go and sit in it. I'm not a gardener by any means, but I've started to look more closely at the flowers in the garden and appreciate them more. So there's definitely it's definitely been. If anybody wants to look back at the very first in this series, and we talked about why I wanted to do photography, it wasn't so much about taking photographs. It was more about becoming more mindful and finding a hobby that kept my mind active, that I could invest time and energy into, because I don't do very well not thinking about things. I don't switch off easily. But part of that was I actually wanted some of the mindfulness that goes with just being a bit more in tune with what's around me. So from that point of view, it has definitely done what I wanted it.
Well, I also found another secondary effect of my photography recently, because sometimes I struggle to go out for walks, especially during the bad weather. And I looked at my watch the other day. I've got one of these watches which record your steps and things. And I've gone out and taken some photographs on one of my photo expeditions that I've sent myself, which are on video at the moment. And I looked at and I'd done 20,000 steps, where normally I set myself a limit, a target, I should say, of 10,000 in a day, and struggled to reach it. All of a sudden, I was halfway through the day, 20,000 steps, and hadn't even noticed because I was so enthralled in doing the photography. So it's got extras on that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming out of lockdown here in the UK and being able to travel further afield. Where the part of the country I'm in is quite flat. But I don't have to travel very far inland to get more rolling countryside, which is going to probably be a little bit more interesting to photograph for landscapes and things.
Talking about interesting to photograph, shall we set you some tasks for the next video?
Yes,
right.
Please.
Well, what I'm going to suggest is I've shown you some of the suggestions on the examples I gave there, and one of the things I really do like are leading lines, whether it's converging parallels, or whether it be curved lines. But I like the idea of them leading to a subject. Now, I'm not really worried, again, what was said about rules. Rules are there to be broken, but if you can use those ideas on that. So I'm going to set you a task again. Go off and photograph what you like. The subject matter is purely yours. But try and incorporate for the next one something to do with leading lines, either converging parallels or leading lines onto something, and take it from there as we go. Now, one of the things that we did see on one of your photographs was the concentric circle idea. Effectively, they are leading lines. They are curved lines, but lead you in, almost tunnel effect. Do something on that, and come back and see what you can get. Get me 4 or 5 shots on that one. How's that?
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Brilliant.
Now, what I'm going to do is, anybody who has watched this, as I say, we're doing this because of the fact that we enjoy doing this as a video. We just decided to do these videos so that if you can get something out of it at home, we've won. We're doing it mainly for the fact that Bev and myself can get some enjoyment out of our photography between us and learn something between. But if you are enjoying this, don't forget to hit subscribe on the button below. Give us a thumbs up, because that gets YouTube to promote these to other people. We're not monetized. We're not making money out of this. It's not being done as a business. This is purely for our enjoyment. And if we can give one little thing that you can learn from it, then even better. So
is it possible? Would it be possible if people are watching, if they wanted, I don't know if you can do this on YouTube, you're the YouTube expert, could they post a photograph that they've taken below so we could potentially look at it?
That's a good point, actually. I'm not sure that you can. Certainly leave a comment on things, but if you have got a photograph which you would like to submit, leave us a comment. I'll see those comments and I can contact you back and give something on. I'll give it an email address. I might actually try and put an email address down. If you find there's an email address below, then put it in, but give a little description as to why you've given the photograph and what it is. Give it on a JPEG format if you can, because then I'll be able to get it. But I'll put an email address on there. In fact, let's have a think. If you do it to fourcountiesphotography@outlook.com, that's all one word, fourcounties photography@outlook.com. Send it off. Give us a little description as to who you are, because I'll give you a mention on it. We won't do I don't do hard critiques on photographs, because who am I to pull somebody's photo apart? But I can certainly look at, in a way I have done with Bev's. And I'll also encourage Bev to actually to give your opinion as well, because I think that's vitally important that somebody who's at the start of the journey does the critique as well. It's wonderful to see. So yes, I'll put that link below for the email address. Send us an email, tell us what it is about it in the email, and I'll try and feature it on here.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind either if people want to leave their comments on what they think of my photographs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As I say, as long as it's constructive. I don't like it, isn't going to help me much, but I'm not sure I like it because would work great, because that gives me some feedback as well. So,
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Right. I shall look forward to the next one. I'll give a couple of weeks on this for there. As you said, we're coming out of lockdown. We've got another raise on the level tomorrow. Tomorrow we can actually meet each other in a pub on the outside outside the building in the UK for a drink. So we're going to have some big changes, and hopefully the weather's going to improve as well for this. So until the next time, Brian James signing off, and
Bev Thorogood, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure again. Cheers.
Bye everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.